So you make me host it up.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's book discussion. I am Yako Hardiman and I am a part of the events team here at University Bookstore. Tonight, Dr. Anu will be in conversation with multi-genre writer Reagan Jackson about her book, Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World. Dr. Anu has been an educator and professor at the University of Washington for over 20 years, with an emphasis on race, gender, equity, and global literature. She is also a DEI and racial equity consultant who offers coaching and training for various businesses and organizations. Guilt Trips has been a finalist for several book awards, including the Washington State Book Award, and was listed by Oprah Magazine as one of the best 26 travel books of all time. In addition to being a writer and activist, Ms. Reagan Jackson is co-executive director of Young Women Empowered and co-founder of Blackout Healing. Ms. Jackson is passionate about providing young people with mentorships, leadership skills, and the opportunity to experience world travel. She's taken over 200 youths abroad to Japan, Guatemala, and Mexico. Links for Guilt Trips and any other books mentioned during this talk will be added to the chat. Please submit your questions to either Dr. Anu or Ms. Jackson in the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. Simply click on the link and type your questions there. This discussion is being taped for YouTube and can be viewed there after the event. I am now going to turn the microphone over to tonight's guest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay, thanks for that awesome introduction. So Anu, why this book?
Hi.
Hi.
Great to be in conversation tonight, Reagan.
Yeah, ditto. Yeah, so yeah, why this book and why now specifically?
So this book, Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World, is, as I say in the first page, the book that I've always wanted to read, but I never found. It's a collection of stories and reflections and critical analysis that are reflective of conversations that I've been having for a very long time, but haven't seen in a written form in this way. I, like you, am an educator and have been taking students to parts of the global South for 15, 16 years and thinking about the world close to home or far away through the lens of equity and through the lens and the long history of inequity raises all kinds of complex feelings in us, raises all kinds of complex contradictions, complex negotiations that we have to do with who we are, how much we have, where we come from, what does it mean to be in the space that we're in and not there or not there. We're here, wherever that here is. And I wanted a book that helps shepherd people through some of these conversations with some humor, with some gentleness, with some skills. You know, so much of my work is around bringing people together to talk better about the things that we've often been socialized to not talk about. And so this book is very much in that genre, very much so.
That's always the most fun part too, right? To speak the taboos.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, I just keep coming back to this idea, right? If we are so nervous and nerve-wracked to speak about the things that we actually need to speak about, how will we ever make change? Mm-hmm. How are we ever going to do something different than what has been done? How will we ever put into action some of the incredible creativity, organizing, activism, and quiet moments of solitude that move us forward as a people together, that create more opportunity, more dignity, more space of loving kindness for people? Means we're going to have to talk better. We're going to have to figure out how to do this thing called uncomfortable conversations, right? And again, this is whether you're sitting right here, wherever home is for you, or you're in Kenya or Nicaragua or far away, right? The questions of inequity and the long history of some people having more than others, it animates our life wherever we are. So why not get better thinking and talking about it so we can actually put into practice more of the values that we want to live by and that we want to offer one another and ourselves. That's so much of the spirit of this book.
I think that's also just kind of a great equalizer in a way too, is acknowledging the discomfort that shows up. It's not just one person is uncomfortable, like it's kind of a universal experience actually of wondering and comparing, like, oh, who am I in this moment? How are people receiving me in this context? What am I complicit in? What am I not? What's my point of agency? What can I do? Those types of things.
How could we not, right?
Mhm.
How could we not? It's not because you and I are flawed that we notice who's around us, how much they have, how much we have. It's because our entire society is built on hierarchy. And when we are built on hierarchy, hierarchy means judgment. Hierarchy means noticing. Hierarchy means having complex feelings about all of this. And feelings sometimes are about discomfort. Feelings are also sometimes fatigue. Feelings are sometimes frustration. Feelings are sometimes, I can't even think anymore about this. We have a range of feelings, right? A range of feelings that are constantly playing out, constantly. Right.
So I'm curious, like, about your background and what was your kind of entry point into doing study abroad?
Hmm. I often think of myself as a cultural go-between. I'm an in-between and a go-between.
Mhm.
I think growing up in the United States as somebody who's not white and as somebody who's not black has made me very aware of the polarized ways that race was spoken about throughout my youth, either white or black, white or black. And this very nebulous anything else had no language around it, but that some nebulous something else was my reality. And so trying to think about where I and my family and my community fitted in to this black or white construct kind of helped me think through why a dichotomy can be helpful, but also the limits of a dichotomy, right? If you only think about race in terms of black and white, where that's such a critical access to think about power and opportunity and the lack of dignity that has been embedded into this country. But race is also much more complicated than black and white. And how do we fit into this structure? So I think thinking about that has always made me come to some of these conversations with worry and curiosity. Worry that I didn't have language to speak it out loud. Worry because I didn't know how to articulate what was coming up for me, but also curiosity. And it's nice as I've grown older and as I've become more settled in myself that there's less worry and more curiosity. I like that the balance has kind of shifted from lots of worry to less worry and more curiosity around who I am and what that means. I've got a lot of questions these days. And I think when I was younger, the questions created a lot of stress. I didn't know how to ask questions or what to do with an unanswered question. These days, it feels pretty good to have some unanswered questions in my mind and in my heart. It doesn't knock me over as it did when I was a younger person. And so I think kind of navigating my own life as the daughter of immigrants to this country and thinking about race and power, sexuality, hierarchy, judgment, who's in, who's out, margins, centers, all of these big concepts have made me curious about being elsewhere, going elsewhere. Throughout my youth, we would go to India every, say, 2 to 3 years to visit family. And those were some big trips as a young person. When again, there's very little conversation about race and power and difference and assimilation and belonging or not fitting in. And so I had my American life, which didn't really fit me and I didn't fit in. And then I had every few years, a few months of my India life, which didn't really fit me and I didn't really fit in there. And so again, thinking about these kinds of back and forth helped me want to bring some of those ideas to students. This isn't just my story. This is the story of lots of us who fit in some ways, don't fit in other ways, are trying to find our path in the world in terms of some rigid hierarchies. And study abroad and international education has a long history of inviting students to think about some of these questions. Actually, let me just say that differently. Study abroad has a long history of taking students elsewhere, but not quite inviting conversation on these kinds of questions, right? And so I was very interested in wanting to combine some of these critical reflections about identity and travel and who we are and who we're not with educational travel and seeing what we can do together. Study abroad is also really white, and I wanted to kind of rethink who we are inviting to experience the world when the world is literally at our doorstep, right? But it's also about who we are inviting to partake in these educational experiences. So my work is about expanding some of those conversations, like your work too. You do so much of this. This is, where you and I intersect in a lot of really interesting ways, right? Wanting to critique the dominant narrative and create some other ways of being, other ways of seeing, other ways of doing.
Yeah, I would say for me, like through the process of getting my master's in international education and setting that intention of wanting to take youth of color abroad, because it was something that really fundamentally changed my perspective and my understanding of the world was having that opportunity to travel and to be abroad. And yes, I felt kind of surprised actually through the curriculum that there wasn't this book. There wasn't any type of invitation to reflect upon who we are, who we think we are, and what we're taking when we go into these communities and have these interactions. And same with during, I guess I shouldn't have been so surprised because I felt the same way during my own experience of studying abroad, where it was an impactful and beautiful experience, but one that was definitely not designed with me in mind.
Right. I can't tell you how many students over the years, Reagan, I have had in front of my office, students who I don't know, saying, my roommate was in a class of yours, or somebody I know was in a program of yours last year, but I just came back from Chile or from China or from Peru. And can we just talk? Can we just talk about why we never once on my program thought about, talked about, said out loud that we're all having different experiences here, that we're not a homogenous group. We might all be from one university or from one organization, but we're not having the same experience. And that has everything to do with who we are, what we look like, how we are read, how we are reading others, the long history that we are stepping into. The dynamics on our program are structuring our trip, but we have so little avenue to talk about it. Why? And years of these kinds of conversations also is what brought me to write this book. I had so many stories in my head of travelers, students, faculty, people that I met, my own stories that I didn't quite know what to do with anymore. They were crowding my mind. And so I started the book by just writing some of these down, not quite knowing what I was writing, what the book would look like, but just creating a collection of small little vignettes, and then seeing what I might do with them and how we might be able to read them together in order to have precisely those conversations that you and I never had when we were studying abroad. I studied abroad as a young person too, and there was no conversation about these kinds of issues. And yet it was such a noisy conversation, but we were silent, right? And that that takes up space in our heart. We worry, we feel it, it lands on us differently. Well, so then the beautiful and transformative experience that we could have feels really crowded with all these other things that are going on as well, right? And why do only some of us have to deal with this and not others? It's our responsibility as educators, as tour guides, as people in the travel industry, as people who put together curriculum. We need to have more spaces where we can talk together. We're not trying to solve everything. We're just trying to talk better together, right?
I love that framework. Would you just share with us a bit? Like, would you like to read
Sure.
some excerpts? Yeah.
Well, I used the word vignette a moment ago, and the part, so here's what the book looks like. It is illustrated by Seattle graphic designer and artist Ronald Otts-Wallace, who's done a wonderful job with beautiful illustrations throughout. Thank you so much, Otts, for that. The part that I'm going to share with you all is somewhere in the middle, where I have a section devoted to really small vignettes of different kinds of travelers, so we could look at some of these stories and juxtapose them with each other. So I'll read you two short vignettes of travelers who are in India. And here is Jane. Jane says, "Me being white here in India, well, it feels really different than me being white in Canada," says a white woman undergraduate named Jane that I meet in India. She's studying abroad in the western part of the country. "In my hometown, almost everybody is white. I never thought much about who I was. Here in India, though, it's kind of a big deal sometimes. People come up to me, want to talk with me, and take a photo with me. Sometimes people will just plop their babies into my arms and want a photo with me carrying their kid. It was pretty weird and unnerving at first, but I've got to admit, I also love the attention that I'm receiving." Jane rests for a moment and reflects. "I'm just a regular person at home, but here, I'm a celebrity without doing anything at all. It's strange, but wow, what an incredible experience to have people approach me solely because of the way that I look." Her voice is exuberant and breathy. That's never happened to me before at home. I've always had to do something to be recognized back home. Here, just being me is enough to feel special. So keep Jane's story in mind. Let me share with you another story of a traveler. This traveler named Jasmine. "I feel excluded in the US in more subtle, hard to prove ways," a Filipina American student named Jasmine writes in her journal assignment during one of my programs. "Here in India," she writes, "it's more explicit. Some Indians flock toward the white people in our group and ask if they can take a photo, leaving me and the other folks of color by the wayside. I've literally been gently pushed out of the camera's frame because local people wanted to take a photo with my white classmate. It's not everyone here, mind you. Lots of Indians really don't care about foreigners or white people and just go about their business, so I get that it's not everyone. But being excluded from a photograph, even a couple of times, is still powerful. I knew race and racism as complex ideas in the US, but I didn't realize how these ideas also shape cultures around the world until this trip. There are so many images of light-skinned Indians everywhere in India, even though skin shades are from light to very dark. Where are all the dark-skinned people in the media? The fairness creams I used to see in the Philippines when I was younger never used to freak me out until now. I guess I never thought about them too much. Pale-skinned Indians and Filipinos both dominate media and are visibly associated with wealth, beauty, or power, regardless if the norm in a particular region is dark skin. When will white fall out of fashion? I think I've learned more about whiteness and white culture while being in India and the Philippines, more than I could ever have imagined." I love these two stories together. What do you hear, Reagan, when you hear these two stories together? What stands out for you?
I mean, that question, when will white fall out of fashion? I'm like, ooh, I'm
Right?
still asking that. Definitely, there's resonance for me, and that I feel like I've had both experiences depending on where I've been. I lived in Japan for 2 years, where I was definitely a celebrity. Like people literally followed me around in grocery stores and like wanted to know, what do Black people eat? Or, just they had a lot of really interesting and at times comical, but also somewhat invasive and challenging ways in which they would uh, navigate my visibility. And
That's a great phrase. Yeah, right. Mhm.
yeah. And I don't know. So what comes up for me is kind of an activity that I used to do in preparing our youth to go abroad. And it was identity circles.
Mhm.
So kind of drawing a line and then putting these different circles, these kind of categories. So your age, your ethnicity, your skin color, your height, your weight,
Mhm.
your religion, all of these different things. And then on the top, you could check a box on the top if you feel like you're an agent or you have a lot of agency in that area. And you can check the box on the bottom if you feel like that's a place where you're a target, or you feel like you're not necessarily you might be partial to being oppressed in those categories because of those reasons.
Mhm.
So we'd always do that, start with the US context of that, and then whatever country we're going to, look at our identities and see if those categories would shift at all.
Right, right.
Because I think we're taught that it's static, right? Like you're always one thing.
Yeah. That's a great assignment for any of us, even if you're not going abroad, to do. And I really like the movement of an assignment like that, starting with where you are. You'll notice in Beyond Guilt Trips, there's lots of conversation about where we are, if that is the US, wherever the West is. And I do that very specifically because identity looks different based on where we are and based on the context that we're in. And so the fact that Jasmine, the Filipina young woman, is thinking about not only her context in the US, now she's abroad in India, but she's also thinking back to when she's visited the Philippines and the messages that she has received there. Her identity is triangulated from these three global locations, right, in a way very differently than Jane, who has not had that opportunity. And the first time that she is abroad feels like that kind of celebrity with a lot of weird guilt stuff coming up for her as well. It's one thing to be known as different, but as you have experienced, the kind of comical but invasive, there's a fine line between some of that. And it's comical that somebody would want to take a photo of somebody just because they're there. On the other hand, there's something, and I've heard this from a lot of white travelers, there's something of that celebrity status that feels very different because you are seen as the norm at home. But that norm at home, right? White skin for white folks has given white folks advantages at home that are invisibilized. So it's a really complex and complicated thing. And when you've got a program or a tour with a Jane on it and a Jasmine on it, and no conversation in the program between the Jane, the Jasmine, and the 15 or 10 or 20 other people who might include me and you and a range of other identities, right? There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to unpack. So I've written this book as a guide. I want it used as a guide where again, we can just shepherd some of these conversations through by reading a common book together. The book has lots of questions for us to talk about together. It's written from an educator's perspective to be used as a guide in that way, right?
I also think using the vignettes in the way that you do as well is really helpful because one, like these are very tangible things that come up or things that can happen. But when they happen on your trip, sometimes it's hard to talk about it from the first person, or like it seems like this would be a nice way to kind of diffuse that, or just have a conversation about Jane and Jasmine, but it's really relevant to
Right, Absolutely. That's another reason that I think the vignettes can be really powerful. We can see ourselves in it, right? We can see ourselves. Whether
Anu,
we
can
have,
you check your volume and see if there's a way to turn it up?
sure, what should I do? Can you tell me?
I think just check your volume on your computer and see if you can turn it up just a little bit.
Okay, how about this?
Sounds good to me.
All right.
Just responding to the chat here.
Well, yeah. Oh, Shoutout is here. Hello, Shoutout. How nice to have you here. Thanks. Great.
Yeah.
So let me, I will have two other short vignettes that I want to read in the same way.
Mhm.
So let's read here. Here is from Layla. A mixed race African and Asian American student named Layla is on a program in France and shares a homestay with a white classmate. Layla told this story to her professor, who's a friend of mine, who then shared the details with me as an example. The homestay family members in France are nice, but they seem more comfortable with the white student. When Layla and her white classmate return home from program activities, the family focuses on the white classmate. They ask her about her day, practice French with her, and offer to take her out on the weekend to local sites. To Layla, they are polite but guarded, polite without being warm. Layla talks to her professor about the situation and how she's feeling. I'm not sure what to do, she says. There's nothing specifically wrong, since the family has provided all the things they're supposed to do as a homestay family. But yes, it's clear that they are much friendlier to my roommate and pretty neutral to me. Layla pauses to collect her thoughts. I get the feeling that they are more comfortable with my roommate and relate better to her because she's white and more like them. Maybe they just don't know what to do or say with me because I'm Black. I don't want to make my roommate feel bad because it's not her fault the family is this way, but I just wish she'd notice and say something. I'm nervous to bring it up and draw more attention to this as I'm the only person of color on this program. I don't want to make a big deal about a feeling I have that the homestay family likes the white girl more than me. And plus, if I'm right, what am I supposed to do about it? So that's Layla. And let's learn a little bit about Sanat. For my student Sanat, who has been born in the United States, the daughter of Eritrean immigrants, her study abroad program to Ghana was to be a homecoming of sorts. Her first opportunity to return to the African continent of her parents and her ancestors. Ghana in West Africa is different than East Africa, but closer to her Eritrean roots than the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where she'd been born and raised. She describes feeling as though her world has seemed split between the Eritrean diaspora community of her parents and the mostly white schools that she's attended. In college, she gravitated toward classes that help explain her homeland and the African continent beyond the usual stereotypes of poverty and corruption. Will things feel different in Africa than they do in the United States, she wonders? What will it be like to be in all Black space all the time? She is overwhelmed with possibility and apprehension. Now, in Ghana's capital city of Accra, even though Sanat is as Black as most Ghanaians, Ghanaians somehow know that she is a foreigner, an American, an Obruni, even though her skin looks like theirs. People are friendly and welcoming, but she is not a daughter of the soil as she had once hoped. Or rather, she is in some ways, but not as she had imagined. Her identities don't seem to fit together here the way they work at home. In the US, she says, I'm Black and African. Here, I am coming to terms with being seen not as African and more as American. Here, I am lumped in with rich and power-holding people from the West, including whites. But in my everyday life in the US, I'm Black and African, and clearly different than actual whites. When can I be Black, American, and African all at the same time? And again, I love these two stories together. They feel really poignant, right? They feel heartbreaking, they feel poignant, and they demand us to have better language to be able to speak together and hold Layla and Sanat's stories with grace and care, what is Layla to do as a student living in a homestay family that's got all these different dynamics going on? How do we, as part of the program, what does that mean to us? What does allyship mean to her white roommate who's not noticing that this is happening? It shouldn't be on Layla to have to say everything all the time. How much burden is that, again, on the person that not only is experiencing everything, but has to like shepherd other people through it, right? To, allyship in this case means that the roommate should be like, are you noticing what's going on? I'm kind of noticing that I'm getting all the invites and you're not. What's up with that, right?
Well,
Opening the
and
door.
also the training, right? Like who's training the homestay families? Because I actually do think that that warmth is a requirement. Like,
Certainly, right? There's a lot of different dynamics that are playing out there. And in Sanat's story, we have so-called heritage participants on programs, people whose families might be from that community that they are going as a student or as a traveler, but the experience can be really different for that person, right? A Peruvian American going to a program in Peru might look different for that student or that traveler or that tourist than somebody who's going to Peru for the first time. And again, having language to really reflect the richness and complexity and sometimes heartbreak of some of these experiences is what I feel like so many of our trips are lacking, right? And hoping that through these small little vignettes as well, there's a lot of stories of my own travels throughout the book and many, many other people's, and being able, as you said earlier, to see something that might be like us or might be a little different than us, and use that as a text to say, oh, what do you notice? Is that kind of like what's happening on our trip? Is that kind of different? Let's develop some vocabulary in some small building blocks, in a building block kind of way, so we can talk better together, right?
these are really, I think, good stories to kind of speak to why I wanted to do this work in the first place, or to become a study abroad program director. I didn't even know that that existed until I was 20. And then I was like, wow, what a job. Like, you just get to take people abroad and have these experiences. But what I found is yeah, like there's a huge gap in terms of the way in which administrators are trained, or not trained, I should say, in having these conversations and being able to curate and hold spaces
Yes.
for a variety of folks, and not just predominantly white upper class women who have been traditionally like, who gets to go abroad.
I work with a lot of educators, and for the most part, the educators I work with, thoughtful, well-intentioned, they know that these conversations are important, and they have had so little opportunity to develop their own skills around holding complex, unanswerable, unended conversations, either at home or abroad, right? So being abroad and having these conversations is not that different than being closer to home, wherever you are, and having these conversations. They still require courage. They still require us to be uncomfortable with not knowing everything. They still require vulnerability. They still require being okay with not fixing everything in front of us right then and there. They still require us to hold space for stories that are different or similar than ours. That's not necessarily tools we need only abroad. We need that at home too, right? So that's why throughout this book, I've been trying to make connections back and forth between conversations that we have at home and conversations that we're having abroad. They're the same conversation, right? Very, very similar in a lot of ways. The context is different for sure, but they're the same conversation.
Yeah, well, and I think the context can leverage what the impact of the conversation can be.
Right, right.
So as we're chatting, folks, like, feel free to put some questions in the chat, or also any of your own reflections, because I don't know about you, but as I'm listening to some of the things that Anu's saying, like, they're just really sparking like, oh, wow, you know.
That's what I hear from so many readers. I mean, I just have to say that the fact that this book is circulating seems pretty miraculous to me. It was sent to 35 presses and was rejected 34 times, and was published by a very small press. And people are learning about it. People in international education, in race and equity circles in the US, in the travel community, it's slowly moving. And as this last year especially, I'm hearing from these different readers, they say exactly what you just said, Reagan. Like, oh, reading it is making me think about that trip that I did when I was 21 in Nepal. That all these confusions are coming up for me again. All these moments that I didn't quite know what to do with, that I had buried somewhere, they're all peeking out now because maybe I've got some language to understand it in a different way. Maybe I can care for myself in a different way by letting some of those stories come to light and learning from them. I mean, that's why we travel, right? If we've got the privileges to simply travel, not to escape war and famine and harm, because that's a different sort of travel. That's travel too, but that's a very different kind of travel. So I'm talking about the travel with safety, the travel to experience something new, the travel to learn about ourselves and others, right? If you're in that category of a traveler, it is in our best interest for travelers like that to have better language, to be able to metabolize their experiences in ways that actually pushes us and helps us shift and grow. It doesn't even have to be big transformational shifts. I'm talking even small changes can change so much. Even small movements matter, right? So why not have some more language to do that, right?
Absolutely. Oh, it looks like we do have a question in the chat from Jackie Guzman, who asked, I'm reading the part in your book where you talk about guilt. My question is, what would you advise we do with guilty emotions when traveling abroad? Great question.
Well, my title tells you something beyond guilt trips. So I am very much an advocate for noticing what is coming up for us and also developing some skills to not stay in it. I think the more you and I simmer in our guilt and shame for having what we have or being who we are, that's actually not contributing to justice in the world in small or big ways. That keeps the conversation very narcissistic and keeps the conversation only in our own mind, ricocheting off our feelings back and forth. The book is an invitation to move beyond that guilt trip and to think about, if I have what I have in the world, what does solidarity look like for me? If I have the resources, advantages, privileges in the world that I do, what does it mean for me to be able to use part of these gifts in ways that offers something to others? More space, more access, more opportunity, more dignity. What does that look like? And those questions, I'm not sure that there's a one size fits all for those questions. That question will look, those answers will look really different for each of us. What I do with my gifts and how I want to live my values towards more justice in the world will look different, I hope, than yours will. We need all different kinds of contributions to make the world better than it is now. We need all different kinds of movements, all different kinds of spaces where we're able to think, talk, strategize, dismantle, and create differently, right? For me, there's no one way to do justice work. There's a lot of ways to do justice work, right? And so, but me simmering in my guilt doesn't get me closer to that justice work. It just keeps me locked in my own stuff that's happening. Oh, I have a lot. Oh, it's me. And justice work is, yes, this is my experience. This is who I am. And what do I want to do with that? That and part is critical for justice work. It's not about erasing who we are. Yes, this is who I am. This is my life. This is what I look like. This is my experience. Yes. And what does partnership look like? And what do I do with what I have? And how do I actually mobilize some of the gifts that I have been given, fairly or unfairly, to mobilize it elsewhere, right? That and part to me is critical, critical. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one thing that always comes up for me, I'm glad that you shared a bit too, is about your writing process and about just who is ready to hear this book and who wasn't. But anytime you write a book, I feel like as soon as you finish, then you have like 8 million things you should have put in that book or wish that you could have put in that book. So I'm wondering, like, what's next after this for you?
Yeah, good question. It's a question I'm thinking a lot about these days, Reagan, as I kind of come back to my own writing and come back to the page after a while of not doing so. Um, this book, it certainly is has conversations at home, but it's kind of oriented toward the traveler with good intentions. That can be the student traveler, that can be a tourist, a backpacker, whatever. But it's oriented toward the person that is going elsewhere and trying to find some connections between conversations there and at home. I think as I do some more writing, I'm starting to want to unpack some of what I'm noticing in a lot of my racial equity DEI consulting work. I'm in a lot of different organizations, institutions, nonprofits, companies, schools, colleges, and I've got multi-sector experience, and I'm starting to see the ways that things look different and things also look the same across sectors. Of course, a nonprofit is really different than the corporate sphere. Of course, a corporate sphere is different than higher ed. And yet, I'm having similar conversations with people in all of these sectors. And I've got a lot of rich, confusing, complicated stories that are in my head that are slowly making their way to the page now these days. That might be, who knows, it might be what my next book is about. I'm not sure yet, but that's some of what's on my mind a lot. Especially, what organizing means these days. What does equity work look like these days? It looks something different than it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. 4 years of the last presidency has kind of created a lot of woundedness in some very deep, deep ways throughout different communities. Black Lives Matter movements and organizing and activism all last summer that was simply at the crescendo. It was a more public crescendo. That activism has been going on for decades and centuries, and it has been continuing, even if the conversation has looked differently. I think all of these social movements and social pressures have made our organizing and justice work look different over the last many years. And these are some of the conversations I'm in a lot these days. And so I think they're on my mind a lot. They're in my mind and they're on my heart, in my heart a lot. So writing is a way to kind of help unpack some of that. You're a writer. I want to just share with everyone Reagan's book here, Still Here, right? A South End mixtape from an unexpected journalist. And one of my favorite lines in your book is where you say, do people in Seattle care about tacos more than they care about Black lives? And can you just say a little bit about what that line means for you?
Yeah, well, okay. So it was in reference to an article I wrote after attending a Black Lives Matter protest, and then subsequently a really incredible like taco truck smackdown. There was like taco trucks, international conglomerate of taco trucks, and there's just so many more people who were invested in standing in a long line to get a duck taco than there were people invested in believing or being an advocate for the fact that our lives matter. And it just was so, it was very glaring that the absence, or the lack of intentionality around around really showing up. Because particularly, I think Seattle is, we have a lot of street cred as being this, liberal bastion of people who are really progressive, and everybody has that, what's that line sign that everybody has? It's like, in this house we believe that Black Lives Matter, and trans rights, like it just got, like, it goes through the entire list of all these like espoused beliefs. And then the question becomes, though, do you really get to say that if you're not acting on it on a daily basis? Do you really get to get the credit without doing any of the sacrifice or the work or showing up when folks say we need you?
I think the thing that I have learned over the years that still feels just as powerful now as when I first learned it is that some people's lives are worth more than other people's lives, and some people's suffering matters less to us than other people's suffering. And those two notions, I couldn't believe it when I actually, like, when it crystallized for me at some point early in my maybe late teens or something like that. And now, 30 years later, it still feels like these reverberating comments and commentary on who we are. How is that possible? How is that possible with all that we have, all the resources that we have in the world, with all the technology, the creativity, the good intentions, the organizing and activism that is present in communities both far and near? How is it that we have these unexamined notions that these lives matter more than these, and that suffering matters less than that suffering? How is that possible? I feel just so deeply flummoxed that we are here still over and over again. And they sound like really kind of small statements in some ways. They feel really big to me in a lot of ways.
No, let's not diminish it. I think it is huge. It's and that to me is it's the why of this work.
Yeah, it's the why of this work.
Like, why take people abroad? Why go and travel to these other places if not to make connections, if not to create opportunities for people to disabuse themselves of that myth that their life is somehow more valuable, or that someone's life that looks very different, is structured very different, that is filled with different food or different work or different opportunities, that would somehow be less than. I think for me, going abroad the first time, I was 16 and I went to Senegal with my mom on a faculty exchange. And what it did for me, it shifted my understanding of what was finite. I feel like I was fed this idea of this is what it means to be Black. This is what it means to be, and list all the identities that I identify with. And traveling abroad completely unboxed me in a way that liberated me as well, to be able to allow other people to unbox themselves.
Nice.
And then to begin from there to have these deep relationships and deep connections. Like, it's crazy. I have homestay families around the world that I'm still in contact with, for years. And how, like, that love and care, I think, again, with it seems simple, it seems small. Oh, just to love and care and connect with someone across difference, but it's huge and it's absolutely transformative.
And that love and care and those small connections that we might make abroad, to me, the joy of traveling and relishing in the privileges and advantages that I have to be able to do this work is about being able to bring those very small, sweet moments home and having them animate my life here. that's how I make my travels matter at home. It's not just I was there, or that's the Anu that was traveling there, and this is the Anu that's home. I mean, I am Anu anywhere I am, but that context looks different. But the sweetness, even, or the complexity, right? It doesn't have to all be sweet. Even those like hard questions that come up. I'm sure that you learned a lot about unboxing yourself in Senegal at the tender age of 16. I'm sure you had a lot more questions too about you
Okay.
and the world and colonialism and race and all that. And carrying those sweetness as well as those questions with us, like that's the souvenirs that I want in my suitcase when I come back, right? That's what actually kind of threads our world better together. The more that we've got opportunities to ask these questions and hold them across context, right? Yeah.
I see another question in the chat. This one comes from Tina Curry. And is your advice for traveling any different for a short trip or study abroad versus longer term abroad, like Peace Corps, 2 to 3 years, or working abroad?
Hi, Tina. So sweet for you to join us. Hi, Tina is a Peace Corps person, and so asks from personal experience. So the thing with short-term trips is that they're short, right? That sounds so obvious, but let's just kind of open that notion up a little bit. When you are somewhere for 3 days, 2 weeks, your ability to create routes and see things from a wide range of lenses is limited. When you are somewhere for 2 years, figuring out how you're going to wash your clothes and where you're going to get your grains and which day is market day and who you need to align with in order to help your project move to the next stage, that's a very different sort of investment in a community. And people are differently invested in you. If I'm just passing through a community for 2 days, 3 days, a week or 2, nobody should be really that invested in me, right? I'm just kind of here and there. But if I am to be in someone's community for a year or 2, my responsibility to the community shifts. Are there ways that we can kind of pretend our short-term trips are actually long-term trips, even if they're 2 days, 2 weeks? Because, the worst thing to do is to imagine, oh, it's just 2 days. I don't have to care about that community. I don't have to care about how I'm acting. I don't have to care about any of these issues. It's just 2 weeks. That does nothing to be a more mindful traveler. That does nothing, right? Could I imagine that my 2 days might matter, not to the community that I'm in, but to me? Could I imagine that those 2 weeks that I'm somewhere might matter, again, less to the community, but to me? Like that, I think those kinds of shifts can help imbue our short-term trips with a little bit more heft, right? Short-term trips are kind of seen as light, long-term trips heavy. I'd like to imbue our short-term trips with a little bit more politics, a little bit more accountability, a little bit more mindfulness, so we can be elsewhere with a little bit more grace. Why wouldn't we want that? Whether you're somewhere for 2 days or 2 years, if you wanted to be a more mindful traveler, no?
On that note, which I think is a beautiful sentiment to end things on, I wanted to thank both of you for tonight's conversation. It was very enlightening thinking about the different ways that we can approach study abroad and traveling into different parts of the world. I also wanted to thank tonight's attendants and anyone who's rewatching on YouTube when this is uploaded later. Links for guilt trips are on our website, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reagan.
Thank you. It was really fun, Anu.
Thank you.